You're back. What is up, guys? In this video, we're going to learn about checked continuations, or just continuations. The reason for these is more or less to convert code that is not compatible with async await to code that is compatible with async await. The biggest use case here is when you're working with SDKs and APIs that are not updated for Swift Concurrency, you can use a continuation to convert them to be usable with your async await Swift Concurrency code. All right, welcome back everyone. I am back in our Xcode project and we have been downloading a lot of images in this playlist just because the API that I've been using is super easy to use. I really hope they don't ever make that private because then this whole playlist would need new APIs. But we're going to use it yet again in this video, although in the last two videos we were focused on performing multiple asynchronous functions at once. This video is actually taking a step backwards and focused on performing a single asynchronous function, but using an API that is not set up for async await. Because so far we've been using this URL session.share.data, which Apple very cordially provides to us as an asynchronous function. But a lot of the time that we are using, especially any kind of third-party SDK, it's not going to be updated for async await, or at least not for a while. And a lot of these SDKs and third-party frameworks aren't constantly updating their entire framework. So what we're going to do is create a bunch of continuations to basically convert something that's not an async await to something that is async await capable. So let's right-click the navigator, create a new file. It will be a Swift UI view. And let's call this one checked continuation bootcamp. Go ahead and click create. Once you're inside, let's click resume on the canvas. Let's set up a very simple view here. So again, we're going to do a Z stack and we're going to create a view model. So we'll create a class called checked continuation bootcamp view model. Let's conform to observable object and open the brackets. Let's initialize one in our view with an @state object private var view model. And what do we set it equal to? Our checked continuation bootcamp view model. Inside our view model will be one single @published var, let's call it image of type UI image. We'll make it optional, set it equal to nil, and on our screen we're going to say if let image equals view model.image. If we have an image, we'll put it on the screen with a UI image, and we'll make it resizable. We'll make it scale to fit. We'll give it a frame 200 by 200. I feel like there is a lot of repetition in this playlist, but we do keep learning new things, so I hope it's worth it for you guys. Let me know in the comments. Very simply here, when this view appears, we're going to run a task, and then in our view model, we're going to have a function called getImage, and it will be asynchronous, so we'll call it from our task await getImage. Await view model getImage. Awesome. Again, just like in the last video, we want to simulate a real environment in our app. So chances are we're going to have some sort of networking class in our app. Let's create another class and we're going to call this checked continuation bootcamp. Let's call it network manager. Why not? In this manager, I'm going to create a very simple function called getData, open close parentheses. And this is going to be an asynchronous function that throws and returns data back to our application. It's very common in a network manager to just return data rather than a specific type of data. Like instead of returning an image, because that would be more of an image manager, a network manager just might return data, at least in this example. We're then going to do a very simple do catch that you've probably seen a couple times in this playlist. Firstly, we're going to call URL session.shared.data. We're going to look for the asynchronous from and from a URL. So let's pass in a URL to our function here, and we'll pass it in here. Again, we are not using delegates. If we catch an error, let's just throw it back to the application. And the result of this, as we already know, is of type data and response. So we'll say let data response equals try, and lastly, this is asynchronous, so we await the result. Sweet, we're not going to use this response. Once we get this data, let's just return it back. So we'll say return data, keeping it simple. All right, I'm going to come down to our getImage function here, and let's create a reference to this network manager. We'll say let network manager equals a new instance of the network manager. Firstly, let's get our URL. We'll say guard let URL equals URL string else return. And what URL should we use in this video? Well, probably use the one that we've been using in the entire playlist. So I'm going to go into the last file, paste this URL here, because again, it does not matter where we are fetching it from. But now that we have that, let's call this function, which throws, so we got to call it from a do catch statement. Do catch try network manager dot get data from URL. We'll pass in our URL. We'll say let data equals try. Of course, we know we're going to get that error that this is an asynchronous function, so we need to await on the result. If we get this data, let's convert it into an image. We'll say if let image equals UI image from data, and then we'll open the brackets. And we want to update this published variable, which is going on to the view. So because we're updating our UI, we should probably switch back onto the main thread or the main actor before we update this. So we're going to say await main actor dot run. And then we'll call self.image equals the image that we got back here. If we get an error, let's just print it out here. We'll say print error. I don't think we're going to get an error. And let's run this and see if it works. Click resume on the canvas. This task should fire off immediately. And let's press play. Bang, images on the screen. Nothing new so far. This is all review, all stuff we've already learned. I know. We are running this task and calling getImage. But the thing to point out in this example is that we are using URL session.shared.data. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this data is an asynchronous function already. Apple has updated their API for async and await. This is awesome. If you have an API or a framework that you're using and it has asynchronous functions, perfect. Use them. They're already made for async await. But unfortunately, a lot of SDKs, a lot of APIs are not updated for async await. Some of them maybe will be updated in the future, some might not. But as a developer, you don't want to have to wait for them to update their SDK for you to start using it in async await. You want to be able to convert their SDK from as it is to async await. So I'm going to create another function down here called getData2. Let's open and close parentheses, open the brackets, and let's make the syntax here the exact same as this function. So we also want to return data. But the difference this time is we are going to call URL session.shared.data, and we're going to use the completion handler here. So we're going to look for the URL with completion handler. I covered this at the beginning of this playlist. I covered this completion handler method here. This is one of the original ways that we did asynchronous code in Swift. We use these completion handlers using escaping closures. And it's probably going to be the most common method of handling asynchronous code in Swift SDKs. Completion handlers have been around for as long as I can remember. So unlike async await, where it's something new and SDKs have to be updated for it, I would say it's more than likely that all of your SDKs will at least support completion handlers and escaping closures. So this is a super common kind of situation where if we did not have this and we only had this in the API, how would we be able to convert this into an asynchronous function that throws data? So what we're going to do here is type in continuation. And there's a couple different options here, very similar to the last video where we had a bunch of different task groups. Now we have a bunch of different continuations. Two things to point out: there is unsafe continuations, and then there are checked continuations. More or less, I would always use checked continuations. Unsafe continuations are basically telling the compiler that you are checking it yourself. You are sure there are no errors in the code. So you get, I think, a little bit of a performance benefit by using unsafe continuations, but they are unsafe, and more than likely you should probably just use checked continuations. Of the checked continuations, there are two types. There is checked continuation, and then there's checked throwing continuation. You can probably guess the difference here. One of them throws errors. Because our function, we want to actually throw errors if there is an error, we're going to use the withCheckedThrowing continuation. And then we're going to click enter on the body here, and we're just going to call this continuation. All right, now we're getting our first error. Generic parameter t cannot be inferred. If I hold the option button and click on withCheckedThrowingContinuation, we can see that this returns type t. It is a generic type. It's whatever type we want to tell it to return. So we want to return data. So we can actually just return the result of this continuation, so it knows that it needs to return data. That error should go away. This check and throwing continuation is asynchronous, which means we need to await on the result. And it is throwing, which means we need to try. And then very simply, if we get data back, let's return it back to the app. So we'll say if let data equals data, open brackets. We then want to exit out of this closure and call our continuation and resume back in our asynchronous context. So we're going to call continuation.resume. And we can see here that there's a couple different options. We basically want to either return data or throw an error. So I'm going to return data here. Awesome, this is looking great. All right, now before we move forward, I want to just quickly talk about what's going on here. So when we call these functions from our view, when we call asynchronous functions, we are in a task, right? We've used tasks every video so far in this playlist. So we're in a task in an asynchronous context, and we're calling this, and then we're getting to this line of code where we enter into this withCheckedThrowing continuation. Now I think it's called continuation because essentially we are pausing the task, suspending the task right now to leave the asynchronous context, jump into this piece of code here where we are performing something that is not necessarily in the asynchronous context. And then whenever we are done with this other code, we then want to continue the task that we were originally in. So we are basically suspending the task to run this code, and when we're done, we're going to continue and we're going to resume the continuation. Okay? So that's at least my take on, I think, why it's called continuation. We're going to just continue that task when we're ready. But one thing to point out here is that right now, if we get data, we're going to resume the continuation. But if we don't get data, we never are resuming the continuation. And that's actually a problem, because if we have this task in our app and we come into here and then we never resume or return back to the continuation, well, then we have basically a leak in our app. We have a situation where there's a task that is pretty much never going to return back to the application. That could cause bugs, that could cause crashes. And if we hold the option button and click on withCheckedThrowingContinuation, we can see in the documentation here, it says you must resume the continuation exactly once. So exactly once. That doesn't mean twice, that doesn't mean zero, it means exactly once. So right here, if we get data and we resume it once, perfect. But if we don't get data, we resume it 0 times. That's a problem. If we add another line of code down here to continuation.resume, and maybe we just throw URL error, so maybe if whether or not we get this, we can always call this one. This is also going to cause problems in our app and probably crash our app, because as we saw in the documentation, we need to resume it exactly once. So if we had data, we would resume it once here, and then we would resume it once here, probably crash our app. So we want to be really careful in these continuations that we are resuming them exactly once. So the solution here is basically, if we get the data, let's resume it. We can say else if let error equals error, because we're getting an optional error back here. So if we get an error, let's call continuation.throwing. We will resume throwing the error back to the application. And even here, if we don't have an error and we don't get data, we still have that extra else case here. So we always want to resume it exactly once. So let's be safe here and just call continuation.resume. And we'll just throw a URL error for now and maybe just call it bad URL. So now we know no matter what, when we return from this function, whether or not we get data or an error or else, we are going to call resume exactly one time on this continuation. We have now converted an escaping closure into a function that we can use with async await. I'm going to call this from our code. So coming down here, get data to, I'm going to resume the canvas here. And it is actually not working because I forgot the way a data task works is you set it up and then you actually need to .resume in order to actually execute it. So now that I did that, we should be able to get this working in our app. And we are using get data to, and we're still getting that image back. So again, we've converted a escaping closure into async await using a checked throwing continuation. All right, before we wrap up this function, let's just do one more example just because that was the only example that we've done so far. So let's come down here. Let's create another func here and let's call this one get heart image, open close parentheses, open the brackets. In our task, we're going to call, let's comment this one out. Instead, we will call await viewModel.getHeartImage. That's going to be an asynchronous function. And let's create another function in our network manager here. So let's actually create our own escaping closure this time. So instead of using this one, let's create our own. So I'm going to create a func and call it get heart image from database. All right. We're going to use the classic dispatch queue here. You're not really supposed to use this while you're using async await, but the code in this function is actually not going to be asynchronous. So dispatch queue.main.async after, let's do it after now plus 5 seconds. And we then want to call a completion handler from this function. So it will look like this. We'll add a completion handler. This will be a function that returns void. Another way of writing void is the open and close parentheses. This function is going to accept an image of type UI image, and it's going to be at escaping. I've covered this a bunch. That's why I'm moving fast. In here, after 5 seconds, we'll call completion handler, and we'll pass in a UI image. Let's just use a system name here of heart.fill. I'm going to explicitly unwrap it just for example's sake right now. And let's call this from our code quick. So coming down here, get heart image actually doesn't need to be asynchronous right now. So instead we can say, instead we can call network manager.get heart image from database. It'll return us that image. And then we can say self.image equals image. And we obviously want to make this a weak reference. And this should work. So I'm getting a quick warning down here that we're in a task and we're doing something that is not asynchronous. We'll just ignore that for a second. Let's click resume. Click play, and after about 5 seconds, we should get that heart image on the screen. Awesome. And this is basically what we want to avoid. These escaping closures are hard to work with. They're not enjoyable. And a lot of the SDKs, APIs are going to have these completion handlers. And of course, we want to convert this into async await, because if our entire app is using async await, we don't want to then have to switch back for maybe one file or one fetch request. So my challenge to you guys right now would be to pause this video and create another function called get heart image from database, and make this function a asynchronous function that returns a UI image. And try to convert this function from a completion handler with an escaping closure into an asynchronous function by using a continuation. So the code should be very similar to this, and you guys can put it in here. So I would go ahead and challenge you guys to do that. Pause this video. But if you don't want the challenge, I will do it really quickly as well. So what we're going to do here is add our with checked continuation. And this time we don't need the throwing continuation because this function does not throw any errors. So with checked continuation, and of course we'll hit enter. This will be our continuation. And then in here, we're going to very simply call this function. We're going to say get heart image from database with our completion handler here. And we don't have any errors. And we know that this always is returning us an actual UI image. So very simply, we'll call continuation.resume, and we'll return an image back to the application. This is asynchronous, so we need to wait the result, and we want to return it out of this function. Since it's the only thing in this function, the return keyword can actually be implied, and we can just await like this. Now we can come down to our code. We can get rid of this nonsense. We can make this an asynchronous function, and we can basically say let image equals network manager dot get heart image from database, and then we can say self.image equals image. And last but not least, we need to await this function because it is asynchronous. We can even make this one line of code because we are expert developers, and this looks even better. Let's click resume on the canvas one more time. Let's press play here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And our heart is back. We didn't actually do anything in that function to go onto a background thread. That's why I'm not switching back onto the main actor, but that is beside the point here. This video was all about checked continuations. So we use checked continuations to convert non-asynchronous code into asynchronous code. And the most common use case is taking escape enclosures like we see here, and converting that into async. And we do that by creating a continuation, and then we continue the continuation when we get that data back. The most important thing to note here is that, as it says in the documentation, you must resume the continuation exactly once. So here we continued it once, but do not continue it twice. Do not let it fall through and continue it 0 times. Continue it exactly once, and you will have no problems in your application. All right, that is it for my speech on checked throwing continuations. These keywords look really complicated. They look like they're super confusing, but in reality, as you guys just saw, it's really not that bad once you get a grip on it. I hope you guys were able to follow this. There's a lot of keywords that were thrown around in here, but ultimately this is super powerful stuff, and this is going to really come in handy when you're using SDKs and other third-party APIs, because chances are the majority of SDKs out there are not updated for async await. And what that's going to mean is when you get these APIs, you're going to want to convert them into asynchronous functions, and now you know how to do that. Thank you guys for watching. As always, I'm Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking. And if you are up for it, I will see you in the next video. I think the next video is going to be one of the hardest and probably most important videos of this playlist. So stick around. I'm super excited for it. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but you will see it very soon. Don't forget to hit that like button. Leave a comment below if you are enjoying this playlist. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you have not yet. All right, that's it for me, folks. I will see you guys in the next one.